more about who he is, but Steve and I have worked together for a very long time, over 10 years, probably close to 15 years now, because we share similar values and similar, well, lots of things in similar as far as the forest goes. And he's agreed to come here and talk to the class about his experience as a Indigenous forester and his journey of
struggles.
It's a journey, it's a struggle as an Indigenous forester. So take it away, Steve.
Okay, thank you. Let me just shut everything off here on my phone so we don't get interrupted. Cecilia, thank you for the invite again. I apologize to everybody in the group because I was supposed to be here about a week and a half ago, but something come up of a kind of a family nature and I couldn't make it up. But I'm here today. Like Cecilia said, we go back a little bit of ways. Met Cecilia probably about 15 years ago when she came to the First Nation Forestry Program in to help with her non-timber forest product business, which is running today very successfully. Myself, a little bit of background about myself. It's strange to be in this building today, simply because in 1983, I was the first forester graduate of Aboriginal descent in Canada. But because of my background, I don't care, because of who I am and where I come from, the fact that I'm a First Nation person from the Nagawaganek First Nation, and the fact that I achieved professional designation, I was asked to turn over my Indian status card. And of course, I wasn't going to denounce my identity for the sake of a degree. So that was my experience as starting out with some sort of professional designation. I was the first one in Canada, like I said, who received RPF status, who was First Nation. I was 23 at the time. And you can imagine how difficult it was for me to make a choice. Do I become fully assimilated, as white society would designate it, or would I retain my Mi'kmaq status? It was a no-brainer for me. I retained my Mi'kmaq status. So even though I always say to a lot of people, if you want to know who I am, you Google my name. You'll find out a lot about me. I received awards from the Conservation Council in New Brunswick for my stand against waste sites. But I also received awards under the Forest Stewardship Council certification systems with respect to having the first timber resource management land base in Atlantic Canada, surpassing Irvin's. Irvin can't even achieve forest FSC certification. We did on a First Nation. The first in Atlantic Canada. But of course, because of the audit fees that we had to pay every year, we only held on to it for 5 years. Because we couldn't pay $6,000 a year just to have 3 auditors to come up and evaluate our forest and ask me the question, are we exercising the principles under FSC certification, especially principle number 3, which is the involvement of First Nation communities in forest management. So it was interesting to have 3 non-Indigenous people come up and ask an Indigenous person, do you exercise the rights when it comes to your people? So it was a funny thing to address. So one of the things that I decided to travel down was try to find a way to teach the history of the struggles that we have and continue to have as First Nation people, but also try to identify a path forward. There's a lot of misconceptions out there. There's a lot of things government and industry and First Nations do not fully divulge to society as a whole. But I tell you one thing, First Nations were never ever allowed to effectively participate in the utilizations of natural resources, not only in New Brunswick, but in this country, and still continue to have limited access to what resources are available in this country, despite the fact that we have peace and friendship treaties which talks about total equal inclusion, and it doesn't allow for that. My presentation today is, of course, a lot of the history and struggles that we have will be like, I'll share a lot of them with you, but at the same time, most of what you see up here would be a path forward, or how we can move forward, or how can we change the ways things have been going, but what can change it. And there's a lot of things happening in natural resources lately. The biggest one is this path towards Target 1. Doubling the conservation areas in New Brunswick. Because right now we're only at 4% on Crown land, when it should be close to 10. So the target right till 2020 is to be up to 10% conservation forest, conserved forest. Mind you, we still, even as First Nations, we have concerns as well with conservation and concerns with harvesting, because we find there's no balance in either end. First Nations are the poorest communities in this country. So in a lot of cases we can't talk about 100% conservation because our economies will suffer, what little economies we have. So we've got to try to find that balance of how conservation and building our communities' economies can work. So I'm going to talk about a few things here today. Well, what the option is, the way forward with various steps, the type of prerequisites needs to be needed to move forward. The advantages of going ahead, but also the issues and the observations and how we can proceed to do that. And I get a lot of questions around how come First Nations don't participate in forestry? How come you don't see a lot of First Nation people in these various programs that are offered by various institutions, right from the trades right up to the degrees and professional designations? The primary reasons before, when I was going to school, when I was going to secondary, post-secondary education, I had to get a permission from an Indian agent who was a non-Indigenous person that would write and say, Steve, band number, blah, 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 is going to be attending this university or college for a certain amount of time. If I didn't get that letter, or that from the Indian agent, at 6 p.m. every night, if I was cut off the territory, off the reservation, I was thrown in jail. And that was up until 1985. If we were cut off the reservation at 6:30 at night, we were thrown in jail. The next thing that you would find is that a lot of the regulations and a lot of the regulations and acts that are out there don't pertain to First Nation people. They don't address First Nation issues on reservations. Reservations were designed to corral our people, to put our people in a small piece of land so the Indian agents could manage us. This was after all the atrocities that happened to us throughout history. You hear so many court cases now, so many settlements being directed at First Nations with respect to residential schools, with respect to the 60 Scoop, with respect to the latest one, Indian Day schools, which is recently being settled. And Indian Day School was one of the schools that I went to when I was a young man. And I remember when I was born, my mother was non-Indigenous. She was one of the first non-Indigenous women on the First Nations. My father was an Indian chief of the Eelground First Nation. He was a hereditary chief, but he was also a chief under the Indian Act. And I could remember when I was born, my father, my mother told me I could hear my grandmother, and my parents weren't with me very long, and my grandparents, I never had them very long, but I can remember her saying, "He has good skin." And the reason why my grandmother said that is that it would have been easier for me to go through school because I never had the complexion of my father. I had my mother's complexion. But going through school, I used to get it from the high school systems, and I told you about the university. I used to get it from the First Nation. My own did not look like First Nation. But of course, when I registered at the high school to go to school, when my parents registered me, they knew I was from a reservation. So when I was growing up, I used to get it 24/7. Used to get the names like wagon burner, spare chucker, all that kind of thing. Then when I get home, I used to get called, in part of my language, I used to get called honky, white boy, and stuff like that. So it was tough for me growing up because I was a, pardon the language, a product of an interracial marriage. One thing though I found out was when I met my wife, Victoria, I met her up in Gaspé in Quebec. She was from Red Bank. I met her in Agia, 15 minutes from Eel Ground. My objective when I graduated from high school was leave the reserve, leave the reservation, because they don't want me here, and go to the high schools and that, they don't want me there. I figured if I go to university, because there's so much integration within the university, so many cultures in the university, I never got it from my peers, but I got it from the faculties. I got it from the educators of us as young people. I got it from them. I had one guidance counselor say to me one time, "You're from Eel Ground. You're not going to amount to nothing. Go back to the reservation and stay there." Those are the type of comments I used to get. I remember dealing in forestry with industry, like these larger contractors. I remember dealing with forestry with respect to the treaties. And one, the biggest one is still here in New Brunswick, the yellow machine, I call it. When we used to go and talk about treaties, they used to say, well, Blake Brunston was the forester I used to deal with at the time. And he said, "Steve, you think we can turn back the time when the treaties were signed? That's what you're asking." And I said to him, if we did, if that ever happened and we were able to turn back the clock, you won't be here. Irvin was never here. When the treaties were signed, it was just First Nations and governors from British, or in the case of the Treaty 1775, the New England colonies in Britain. So, you can't move forward if you don't understand what happened in the past. And wondering why First Nations are the way we are, simply because of the way we have been treated. And a lot of things just change now. Like a lot of the young people now see First Nations as having the right to hunt, having the right to go fishing, having right to the resources, able to finally participate in the lobster fishery, able to harvest the 5% that I mentioned up here, the 5.3% allocations under the interim access agreements, able to do that. And whereas they say, well, isn't that enough? You got to remember the court cases. And I'm sure you talked about various court cases. First Nations never had a voice to roughly the mid-1970s. And that first court case was the right for First Nations to actually vote and have representation within the court system. Now, we had to go to court in order to get the right to hire a lawyer. We never had that right until 1972. And unfortunately, on that year, that's when my dad died. I was 8 years old. And never understood none of that stuff. And growing up on a First Nation, my mother, there was 6 siblings, so here's a non-Indigenous woman trying to raise 6 children on a reservation where they didn't want us.